The old classroom clock ticked slowly on the wall as a young boy sat in the back row, his eyes fixed on the math problem before him. The numbers seemed to dance and jumble on the page, refusing to make sense. This was just another difficult day for the quiet kid from South Chicago, who everyone simply called T. Life wasn't easy in his neighborhood. His mom worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, and their small apartment wasn't in the best part of town. But that never bothered T as much as what happened at school. Every day felt like a battle, especially during reading time, or when teachers called on him to solve problems on the blackboard. "Hey dummy, can't you even read?" The words stung as they came from his classmates, followed by snickers and pointed fingers. T would sink lower in his chair, wishing he could disappear. The teachers weren't much help either. They'd sigh and shake their heads, marking his papers with red ink and writing notes like "needs extra help" or "falling behind." But there was another side to T that nobody at school ever saw. Back home, in the quiet of his room, he'd spend hours taking apart old radios and phones his mom brought from the thrift store where she worked. His small fingers would carefully separate each piece, laying them out in perfect patterns on his bedroom floor. He understood how everything connected, how each part worked together like a perfect dance. One day, he found an old computer monitor in the dumpster behind their building. While other kids were playing basketball, T was in his room, carefully opening up that monitor with a screwdriver he'd borrowed from the building superintendent. He not only figured out why it wasn't working, but fixed it by reconnecting some loose wires. His mom found him that evening, the fixed monitor glowing proudly on his desk, while he explained every single step he'd taken to repair it. His mother watched him with curiosity, noticing how her son's eyes lit up when he talked about circuits and connections. She saw how his hands moved confidently when he worked with machines, so different from the nervous boy who struggled to read aloud in class. At school, he might have been the slow kid, but in his room, surrounded by his projects, he was something else entirely. T had a special notebook where he drew detailed diagrams of everything he took apart. The drawings were incredibly precise, with arrows pointing to each component and little notes scribbled in his messy handwriting. While his school notebooks were mostly empty or filled with incorrect answers, this notebook told a different story. Its pages revealed the mind of someone who understood complex systems in ways that went far beyond his years. The other kids never knew about T's projects. They were too busy making fun of how he stumbled over words when reading or how long it took him to finish tests. They didn't see him stay up late, using a flashlight under his covers, studying the old medical textbook he'd found in a box of discarded books. The complex diagrams of the human body fascinated him, reminding him of the circuit boards he loved to explore. His 4th-grade teacher had already suggested he might need to repeat the year. During parent-teacher conferences, she told his mom that T seemed disconnected and unable to keep up with basic coursework. But how could they explain that while he struggled to memorize multiplication tables, he could rebuild a radio from memory or explain how electricity flowed through circuits? What nobody realized was that T's brain worked differently. When others saw jumbled letters and confusing numbers, he saw patterns and connections. While they focused on his failures in traditional subjects, they missed the genius that was quietly growing in that small apartment, surrounded by broken electronics and dreams of understanding how things worked. The bullying and disappointment continued, but something was stirring beneath the surface. T might have been at the bottom of his class, but his understanding of how things worked was growing deeper every day. His mom noticed too, watching her son with growing concern and wonder, knowing there was more to her boy than what his teachers saw. She just didn't know yet how much more there was to discover. The science fair presentation was supposed to be T's moment to shine. He'd spent weeks preparing, building a working model of the human nervous system using old computer parts and LED lights. Each connection was perfect, showing how signals traveled through the body. This was his chance to show everyone what he could really do. But life had other plans that day. As he stood in front of his classmates, the words got stuck in his throat. The harder he tried to explain his project, the worse his stutter became. Someone in the back of the room started making chicken noises, then another joined in. Soon, half the class was either laughing or making sounds. The nervous system works like. T's hands started shaking. The room felt too hot, too small. His carefully practiced words disappeared from his mind. The teacher's attempts to quiet the class only made things worse. Papers slipped from his trembling hands, scattering across the floor as more laughter erupted. "Guess the dummy built something as broken as his brain," someone shouted. The class erupted in laughter. T's face burned with shame as he looked at his project, the one thing he thought would finally show everyone what he could do. Now it just stood there, blinking silently, its lights seeming to mock him too. He ran, past the laughing faces, past the teacher calling his name, past the school security guard who'd tried to stop him. He ran until his lungs burned, finally stopping in a small park 3 blocks from school. Sitting on a rusty swing, he let the tears fall freely. His project, the one thing he was truly proud of, had become just another reason for them to laugh. That evening, his mom found him in his room, but something was different. Instead of his usual tinkering, T was organizing everything in his room with an intensity she'd never seen before. Books were arranged by size, then color. His collection of salvaged electronics was sorted into perfect rows. Even his pencils were lined up by length on his desk. She watched from the doorway as her son moved with almost robotic precision, muttering numbers under his breath. This wasn't her usual quiet, thoughtful boy. This was something else, something that made her mother's instinct scream that she needed to act. "Baby, look at me," she said softly, entering the room. But T kept organizing, kept counting, kept trying to make sense of a world that seemed determined to misunderstand him. She gently placed her hand on his shoulder, feeling him trembling beneath her touch. "They're right," he whispered, still not meeting her eyes. "I'm just stupid. I can't even talk right." His hands kept moving, arranging and rearranging his belongings in patterns that only made sense to him. His mom watched him for a moment longer, then made a decision that would change everything. She'd been saving money for a new washing machine, but that could wait. Her son couldn't. Without telling him, she made some calls, found a specialist who offered testing on a sliding scale, and set up an appointment for the following week. That night, she held her boy close as he finally broke down, telling her everything about the daily taunts, the confusion he felt when looking at words, how numbers got mixed up in his head, and how he felt so different from everyone else. But he also told her about how he could see how things worked in his mind, how he could take apart and rebuild almost anything, and how he dreamed of understanding how the human body worked, just like he understood machines. As she listened, she realized her son wasn't broken, he was extraordinary. The world just hadn't figured that out yet. Tomorrow, she'd start her 3rd job, working nights at the local diner. The testing would be expensive, but she'd already made up her mind. This was about more than just school now. This was about her son's future, and she would move heaven and earth to help him find his path. The testing center wasn't what T expected. Instead of the cold, clinical room he imagined, he found himself in a space filled with puzzles, computers, and interesting gadgets. The specialist, a kind-faced woman wearing bright yellow glasses, didn't make him read out loud or solve math problems like his teachers did. Instead, she watched as he assembled complex 3D puzzles and solved pattern recognition games. Hour after hour, test after test, T found himself actually enjoying the challenges. When given a mechanical puzzle that had stumped many adults, he solved it in minutes, explaining his thought process so clearly that the specialist kept taking notes. For the first time in his life, someone was interested in how his mind worked, not just in what he couldn't do. "Watch this," the specialist said, showing his mom a recording of T working on a spatial reasoning test. On the screen, his hands moved with confidence as he manipulated virtual 3D objects, solving problems that most college students struggled with. "Your son's spatial intelligence is off the charts. His ability to visualize and manipulate complex systems in his mind is extraordinary." Then came the big revelation. The tests showed that T had an IQ of 165, putting him in the genius category. But he also had severe dyslexia and ADHD, which explained why traditional schooling had been such a struggle. His brain was literally wired differently, processing information in unique ways that the standard education system wasn't designed to handle. "He's not broken," the specialist explained, showing them brain scan images. "His mind just works differently. Think of it like a high-performance sports car being forced to drive on a dirt road. The car isn't the problem, it's the road that doesn't match its capabilities." T's mom wiped tears from her eyes as she listened. All those nights working extra shifts, all those parent-teacher conferences where she felt like a failure, none of that mattered now. Her boy wasn't slow or stupid. He was exceptional. But the testing was just the beginning. The specialist laid out a plan. T would need specialized education programs, learning tools, and support systems. His mom's heart sank as she looked at the costs. But before she could speak, the specialist mentioned several programs and scholarships designed for gifted students with learning differences. Your son has an extraordinary gift, the specialist explained. He sees patterns and connections that others miss. The way he understands complex systems is remarkable. With the right support, there's no limit to what he could achieve. That evening, T sat in his room, looking at his collection of dismantled electronics with new eyes. All those times he'd understood how things worked, all those moments when he'd seen connections that others missed, it wasn't despite his brain being different. It was because of it. His mom found him there, still processing everything they'd learned. She sat beside him on his bed, holding a new notebook she'd bought him on the way home. "This is for your ideas," she said softly. "All of them, no matter how big or crazy they seem." T opened the notebook, its blank pages promising a fresh start. For the first time, he didn't see himself as the dumb kid in the back of the class. He was something else entirely, a different kind of brilliant, with a mind that worked in ways most people couldn't understand. That night, he wrote his first entry in the notebook. His handwriting was still messy, the letters still jumped around a bit, but the ideas were clear. He wrote about his dreams of understanding the human brain, of fixing things that others couldn't see, of using his different way of thinking to help people. The diagnosis wasn't the end of his struggles, there would still be challenges ahead. But now he had something he'd never had before, understanding. His mom watched from the doorway as he filled page after page with ideas, a heart full of hope. The boy who had been labeled as dumb was finally beginning to see his true potential, and it was brighter than anyone had imagined. The new school year started differently. T now had tools that worked with his brain instead of against it. His textbooks came with special overlays that stopped the letters from jumping around. Teachers gave him extra time on tests, and he could use a tablet to record lectures instead of struggling to take notes. But the biggest change wasn't the tools, it was in T himself. Understanding why his brain worked differently gave him confidence he'd never had before. When words got tangled on his tongue, he'd take a deep breath and try again, knowing it wasn't because he was stupid. It was just his brain taking a different path to the same destination. His old notebook of machine drawings became his secret weapon. When teachers explained new concepts, T would translate them into diagrams and systems, just like he did with his electronics. Biology wasn't just words in a textbook anymore. It was like a complicated machine, with each part working together in perfect harmony. The first big test came in science class. The same room where he'd been humiliated months ago now saw a different student. T stood at the front, explaining how the human heart worked by comparing it to a car engine. His voice still stuttered occasionally, but this time he didn't let it stop him. He practiced for hours with his mom, turning their small kitchen into a classroom. "The heart is like a 4-cylinder engine," he explained, his hands moving confidently as he pointed to his diagram. "Each chamber is a cylinder, pumping blood instead of fuel." The class sat in stunned silence. Even the kids who used to mock him were leaning forward, actually understanding complex biology for the first time. His grades started climbing. Not just in science, but in every subject where he could apply his unique way of seeing the world. Math became a puzzle of patterns. History turned into interconnected systems of cause and effect. Even English improved when he started thinking of stories as machines, each part working together to create something bigger. The school's science club was next. At first, they weren't sure about letting in the slow kid. But when T rebuilt their broken microscope and improved its focusing mechanism, they changed their minds. Soon, he was spending lunch periods in the lab, helping other students understand complex concepts by translating them into systems and patterns they could understand. Word spread about the boy who could fix anything and explain difficult subjects in ways that made sense. Teachers who had once written him off started sending struggling students his way. "Talk to T," they'd say. "He'll help you see it differently." And he did, using his own experience to help others find their way through confusion. Then came the state science competition. T's project was ambitious, a working model of the human nervous system that could demonstrate how pain signals travel through the body. He'd built it from recycled electronics and parts from old toys, just like he used to do in his room. But this time, he understood the science behind every connection. The morning of the competition, his mom found him in the bathroom, practicing his presentation in the mirror. "What if I freeze up again?" he asked, his old fears trying to creep back in. She straightened his collar and smiled. "Then you'll take a breath and start again. Your brilliant mind isn't going anywhere." He didn't freeze. Standing before the judges, T explained his project with a clarity that came from truly understanding, not just memorizing. When questions came, he answered them with confidence, his stutter barely noticeable as he talked about what he loved. The same classmates who once laughed at him watched in silence as he accepted first place. The local newspaper ran a story about the young genius from South Chicago who'd built an innovative medical teaching tool. But the real victory wasn't the trophy or the newspaper article. It was the realization that being different wasn't a weakness. It was his greatest strength. That evening, his mom found him in his room, already sketching plans for his next project. "I want to help other kids like me," he told her, showing her his drawings for a new kind of learning tool. Maybe being different isn't something that needs to be fixed. Maybe it's something that needs to be understood. The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. T's mom was still in her diner uniform when she brought it in, protected under her coat from the rain. The envelope was thick, always a good sign, they'd learned. When they opened it together, the world seemed to stop for a moment. Full scholarship to one of the top medical schools in the country. His mom pulled him into a tight hug, her tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. All those extra shifts, all those late nights, all those moments of doubt, they'd led to this. Her son, who some had said would never finish high school, was going to become a doctor. But medical school wasn't just about memorizing facts from textbooks. That's where T's unique way of thinking became his superpower. While other students struggled to visualize complex surgical procedures, T could see them clearly in his mind, like taking apart one of his childhood machines. "It's fascinating," his anatomy professor remarked, watching T explain brain pathways to his classmates using an old circuit board. "You see connections that others miss completely." His way of breaking down complex medical concepts into simple mechanical systems helped not just him, but his entire study group. The human brain fascinated him most of all. It was like the ultimate machine, infinitely more complex than anything he'd ever taken apart. He spent extra hours in the lab, studying brain scans and neural pathways. His dyslexia still made reading medical journals challenging, but text-to-speech technology and his remarkable visual memory more than made up for it. One day, during a particularly difficult neuroanatomy lecture, T noticed something others had missed. The professor was explaining a traditional surgical approach to removing brain tumors, showing slides of the procedure. T raised his hand, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "What if we approached it from a different angle?" he asked, quickly sketching a new path on the whiteboard. "If we think of the brain's pathways like circuit boards, there's a safer route." The room fell silent as he explained, his hands moving confidently as he drew, showing how his different perspective could potentially make the surgery safer. The professor stared at the drawing for a long moment. In 30 years of teaching, he finally said, "I've never seen anyone approach it quite like that. This could work." That moment changed everything. Soon, T was doing advanced research alongside his regular studies, his unique understanding of the brain leading to new insights. Money was still tight. His scholarship covered tuition, but living expenses in a big city weren't cheap. His mom insisted on sending him part of her paycheck, but he found ways to manage. He fixed other students' laptops and phones for extra cash, his old skills still proving useful. Some nights, dinner was just ramen noodles, but every bite tasted like progress. The hospital rounds brought new challenges. Some patients were hesitant about the young doctor who sometimes stumbled over his words. But T had learned long ago that being different wasn't a weakness. He took extra time explaining procedures to patients, using simple analogies and drawings just like he'd done in school. Soon, patients were specifically requesting the doctor who makes everything make sense. His fellow residents noticed something else too. In emergency situations, when others might panic, T remained calm. His mind could break down complex problems into simple systems, just like he'd done with his childhood electronics. This ability to stay focused and see solutions others missed saved more than a few lives during his residency. Late one night, after a particularly long shift, T found himself back in the hospital's research lab. As he studied the brain scans of a patient with a supposedly inoperable tumor, his mind wandered back to that little boy in the back of the classroom, the one everyone had called dumb. If only they could see him now, using his different way of thinking to solve medical puzzles that had stumped others for years. His mom had kept his old notebook of machine drawings. Sometimes, when doubt crept in or the challenges seemed too big, he'd flip through those pages. They reminded him that being different, seeing the world in his unique way, wasn't just okay, it was his greatest gift. And now, that gift wasn't just fixing machines. It was helping to fix people. The halls of Chicago Central Hospital felt different now. T walked them not as a struggling student, but as the youngest neurosurgeon they'd ever hired. His old neighborhood was just a few miles away, but it felt like a lifetime had passed since those difficult school days. His first week brought a case that seemed like fate had planned it. A 10-year-old boy with a complex brain tumor needed surgery. The boy's father looked familiar. It took T a moment to recognize him as one of his old classmates, one who had joined in the laughter during that science fair presentation years ago. The father didn't recognize him at first. T had changed. His confidence had grown. His stutter was barely noticeable when he explained medical procedures. But halfway through explaining the surgery, something clicked in the father's eyes. "Wait, weren't you?" T nodded, continuing his explanation without missing a beat. He showed them the brain scans, breaking down the complicated procedure into simple terms, just like he always did. The father sat there, tears in his eyes, as the doctor he'd once mocked explained how he was going to try to save his son's life. "The tumor's like an unwanted guest in your brain," T explained to the young boy, drawing a simple diagram. "We're going to show it the way out, but we have to be very careful not to disturb anything else along the way." The boy nodded, understanding the complex procedure for the first time since his diagnosis. The surgery was challenging. T stood in the operating room, his mind transforming the brain's delicate pathways into the kind of systems he'd understood since childhood. His hands moved with the same precision he'd once used to fix broken electronics, but now they were healing something far more precious. 8 hours later, he walked out to the waiting room. The father stood up, trembling. T smiled. "The surgery was successful. Your son is going to be fine." The man broke down, grabbing T in a tight hug. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "For everything back then, we were wrong. So wrong." But T wasn't done yet. That evening, he sat in his office, looking at the city lights through his window. The surgery's success had made him think about all the other kids out there, struggling like he once did. He pulled out his old notebook, the one full of childhood drawings of machines, and began to write. The next month, he launched a foundation focused on helping children with learning differences. The program would provide testing, support, and resources to families who couldn't afford them. His mom was there at the opening ceremony, still wearing her diner uniform. She'd come straight from her shift. "Remember when you fixed that old computer monitor?" she asked, standing with him after the ceremony. "I knew right then that your mind was special. You just needed the world to catch up and see it too." T hugged her tight, knowing that every extra shift she'd worked had helped make this moment possible. Word spread about the neurosurgeon who could explain complex procedures so simply that children understood them, who saw solutions others missed, and who had overcome so much to get there. Other doctors started consulting him on difficult cases, amazed at how his unique way of thinking found new approaches to old problems. One day, a young resident asked him why he chose neurosurgery. T showed him the old notebook, its pages worn with time. "Because the brain isn't just an organ," he explained. "It's the most amazing machine ever created. And sometimes the ones that work differently are the ones that work best." He kept his old science fair project diagram framed on his office wall, not as a reminder of that painful day, but as proof that being different wasn't a flaw, it was a gift. Every time a young patient or their family felt scared or hopeless, he'd tell them his story. Not to brag, but to show them that labels don't define you. Your mind might work differently, but different could be extraordinary. 10 years passed in what felt like a blink. The small foundation that started in Chicago had grown into something incredible. Hundreds of kids who thought differently, who saw the world in unique ways, had found their path through its programs. But T wasn't done revolutionizing the medical world. His approach to brain surgery, born from years of understanding complex systems like machines, had changed how doctors thought about certain procedures. He developed new techniques that made some operations significantly safer, using paths through the brain that others hadn't considered. Other surgeons started calling it the mechanics approach, a name that always made him smile. One morning, he stood in front of a lecture hall at the same medical school that had given him his chance years ago. But now, he wasn't a student. He was teaching the next generation of doctors. His lectures were different, full of simple analogies and clear diagrams that made complex procedures understandable. The brain isn't just a collection of tissues, he told his students, drawing on the whiteboard with the same enthusiasm he'd had as a child fixing electronics. It's the most sophisticated machine ever created, and sometimes to fix it you need to think differently. His mom sat in the back of the lecture hall that day, still wearing her diner uniform. She'd finally retired from her other jobs, but kept the diner shift, just to keep busy, she'd say. But really, she loved telling customers about her son, the doctor who'd proved everyone wrong. The medical journals were full of his innovative techniques, but T was most proud of the learning center he'd established in his old neighborhood. It was a place where kids who thought differently could find their strengths, just like he had. The walls were filled with both medical diagrams and children's artwork, a reminder that brilliance comes in many forms. One afternoon, a young girl visited his office with her parents. She struggled with the same things he had: letters that jumped around, numbers that refused to make sense. But she could take apart and rebuild computers like they were simple toys. T showed her his old notebook, its pages now delicate with age. "You know what this is?" he asked her, pointing to his childhood drawings. "This is proof that being different isn't wrong. It's just a different way of being right." The girl's eyes lit up as she recognized something of herself in those old diagrams. His research continued breaking new ground. He developed a way to map brain pathways before surgery that made complicated procedures safer. But more importantly, he changed how the medical world saw thinking differences. His success opened doors for others who saw the world uniquely. The old classroom where he'd once been mocked was now a state-of-the-art learning lab, donated through his foundation. Children who learned differently had access to tools and technology that worked with their minds, not against them. The same halls that had once echoed with teasing now rang with discoveries. Late one night, cleaning out his old office for a move to a bigger research facility, T found something that stopped him in his tracks. It was the report card from 6th grade, the one that had labeled him as slow and unfocused. He smiled, thinking how labels could have held him back if he believed them. That report card now hangs in the Learning Center's main hall, next to his medical degrees and surgical innovations. Below it, a simple message reads, "Your mind isn't broken, it's just waiting for the world to understand how it works." The boy once dismissed as dumb had not only become a brilliant surgeon, he changed how the world saw brilliance itself. His legacy wasn't just in the lives he'd saved in the operating room. It was in every child who learned differently and now had a chance to show the world their own kind of genius. "Different isn't less" became his famous saying among students and patients alike. Different is just a different way of being extraordinary. And as he watched another generation of unique minds find their path, T knew that his greatest surgery wasn't on any operating table. It was helping heal the way the world saw different kinds of brilliant.